Well, welcome to the Concussion Legacy Foundation webinar, Helping Concussion and Suspected CTE Patients in Crisis. I'm Dr. Chris Nowinski, CEO and co-founder of the Concussion Legacy Foundation. I hope you and your families are staying safe and healthy during this difficult time. At CLF, we're committed to supporting the mental health of those suffering from the effects of brain injury through the COVID pandemic and beyond. We all know that the endless changes to our daily lives in the last few months have left many of you and your loved ones feeling anxious, confused, frustrated, and sometimes hopeless. Those heightened emotions may make emotional crises more likely. We want you to know that there is support available to help you prepare for and to get through those crisis situations. It's our hope that you leave this webinar feeling more empowered to care for your loved one who might be struggling or to seek mental health support for yourself. We're honored to have mental health crisis experts joining us today sharing their wisdom. First will be Dr. Ciara Dockery, a licensed clinical psychologist and the director of the NFL Lifeline. Then we'll have Dr. David Reiss, a psychiatrist who treats suspected CTE patients. He'll explain the crises associated with CTE and the different options for mental health treatments. But before we get to that, we're going to start by talking to two members of the CLF family who have generously offered to share their experiences to help frame this conversation. So first we'll hear from Noah Abrams and then Karen Kinzel-Zagel. We do want to warn you, as you can imagine from that outline, that the topics discussed during the webinar will be sensitive and potentially triggering to some. We will take a few questions from the doctors at the end of the program, so feel free to submit any you might have to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And a quick note to let you know we're recording this webinar and we'll email it to you next week. We post our webinar recordings on our social media pages as well, so if you don't already, please connect with us there. We also have a new CTE Resources Facebook group that we'd love to have you join. The links to that and all of our social accounts are in the chat now, being posted by Tyler and Julia, who are running the show. So thank you guys. And now it's time for our guests. With our two guests today, our goal is to talk about crisis among both the post-concussion community and the CTE community. While both disorders are caused by head trauma, they're very different. One big picture difference to think about is that one is an injury that is generally not progressive, that's the concussion, and one is a degenerative brain disease that is progressive. Each requires a different understanding and approach. So Noah Abrams is joining us to talk about post-concussion syndrome from his home in New York, where he's been sheltering in place since school was shut down in Boston. Noah will be a senior in the fall, I hope, at Northeastern University, where he's a goalkeeper for the men's soccer team. He suffered a serious concussion during a game in the fall of 2018 and struggled with post-concussion syndrome for about a year. And that's a nice picture of Noah being walked off the field just before they put about 18 staples in his head. So Noah, thank you so much for joining us.
Of course, thanks for having me.
Now, will you start by briefly describing the emotional symptoms you struggled with after your concussion?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the emotional symptoms didn't kick in for a couple days afterwards. I definitely was still kind of had a lot of adrenaline right afterwards, was still kind of focusing on getting back to the field and kind of dealing with staples in my head and just worrying about my team and season. And I would say the emotional symptoms kind of really started to take a toll after a couple of weeks once I kind of realized that my season was over and that I wasn't going to be returning back to the field anytime soon. And I'm generally the type of person that's, really happy, always in a good mood, usually kind of the jokester on the team. And I would say that was kind of one of the first things that I realized that I didn't have in me anymore. And I think that's when I kind of realized that was one of the first symptoms. I felt a lot of anxiety. First off, I didn't know if I was ever going to be able to return back to myself, let alone back to the field. And I kind of felt like the best way I could describe it was I was in this black hole. And obviously there were a lot of people around helping me, but I felt like it was just harder and harder to get out of this hole because the psychological and emotional symptoms of anxiety and depression just kind of kept weighing in day by day. And I thought it was going to be one of those things that after a week or two, I woke up and it was better, like a torn hamstring or a broken hand. But as the days went on and I kept waking up and I wasn't getting better immediately, that's when I would say the symptoms got a little bit worse.
And you talked about those symptoms getting worse in a column you wrote for your school newspaper. Would you read the passage I asked you to read?
Yeah, for sure. The only thing that I could do was sit in dark rooms and cry about everything that was taken away from me, from my sport to my identity. The only time that I felt relief from the constant suffering was when I drank. After a night of drinking and my hangover state returned the following morning, I returned back to my regular thought process. If I jump over my 5th-story fire escape, will all my pain and suffering go away?
You know, that's a profound thing to share, and it's important that you did share. But I think what was interesting, especially interesting to me about that was you hadn't said that before. How did your parents respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, since I've been little, and my extended family and my immediate family, I've always felt like I have a amazing kind of support network. And obviously I've always been focused on soccer and sports. It's been my main focus my whole life. I never really had a sip of alcohol until I was 20 years old. First couple of years of college, I didn't even want to, but I think they were definitely pretty concerned. As I got more open with them, I kind of explained to them that I was definitely drinking more than I was in the past. And I was binge drinking for sure. It wasn't like I was kind of in my room by myself, but when I would go out with friends, I would definitely drink more alcohol. And they were worried for sure, because the type of person I was very driven and didn't like putting anything into my body that was going to kind of hinder my athletic performance. And for them to see me kind of drinking more to get rid of some of the symptoms and some of the emotions I was feeling, they were definitely worried. But that being said, I definitely wasn't 100% transparent with them at the time.
Well, you know, and I think that's an important point. And part of the reason I asked you to share that, and having talked about this with your folks, is that, you know, even though you're very close, right, with your family and your friends, you hadn't told, until that was written, you hadn't told people you'd had these thoughts about jumping off your balcony, right?
Yeah, I just never really wanted to admit it myself. I think the first couple of times it popped into my head, I was almost startled, but I was in a room by myself with kind of suffering with, obviously I had all the symptoms, but now as the emotions started to kick in, I just really struggled to explain it to other people. And even though I felt like I had them on my side, along with a bunch of other friends and family, I just really didn't want to come to terms with myself. And I didn't want to fully explain to them the extent of the emotions that I was feeling.
Yeah, and part of the reason I asked you to share that is, I went through a very similar experience with my post-concussion syndrome, and I think that's a point that I want, especially the post-concussion family members that are watching now and parents, to realize is that when you're a patient with this and you're struggling with this, you don't always tell people how bad things are. And it's important to just have that in your head and realize that. And Noah gives a wonderful example of that. It's hard to open up about this. You don't think people understand. And just know that just talking about it and asking questions doesn't mean you're always going to get an accurate answer as to how much pain people are in. But on the bright side of this, and part of the reason I wanted you to share that is because although you had these thoughts, you didn't take any steps further forward with that. You never had that moment of true crisis. And you told me that you credit your community for helping you sort of keep those emotions in check. Can you tell me about how people helped you?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say everyone helped me, from the athletic trainers that were on the field that day to my teammates to my coaches. I would say you really kind of begin to realize how much people care about you when you really go through some sort of crisis, concussion related or not. And I never opened up to anyone in my life about really anything before. So kind of having all these people by my side, constantly checking in on me. And there were even days where I didn't want people to check in on me, but kind of always knowing I live in an apartment with 4 of my teammates, and one of my teammates was basically on the other side of a drywall. And he would even at night, he would just knock on the other side of a drywall and just check in on me. My parents would constantly obviously check in. They didn't overdo it. And I think that's obviously a hard line for family members to kind of get to, is they're worried about not overdoing it or not doing enough. But I definitely felt the constant support of all my friends, of all my teammates, and my coaches as well. And I think that if I didn't have that constant support, I think that things definitely could have gotten a lot worse.
Yeah, and I think that's another important point is what your family, what your friends, your coaches, what they did for you was really helpful. And sometimes, when there's those daily check-ins and all that stuff, it can feel overwhelming when you're the person checking in. But I think your story sort of speaks to the idea that if you think you're doing too much, you're probably doing the right amount. Would you say?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And then you've also talked in the past about how helpful it's been to talk to other people who've dealt with post-concussion syndrome. One of those people being the board member through which I met you, Doug Warren, sort of mentored your recovery. Can you touch on that and why you'd recommend others have a mentor?
Yeah, absolutely. So prior to my concussion, I've never had a concussion. I've known people who've had them, but I didn't really understand the significance and how it weighed on you physically and emotionally. And I got connected with Doug through a close friend of mine on my team. And he was I had no idea the background that he had. And I spoke to him for 3 or 4 months without ever even putting a face to a name. And he was a professional soccer player. He was a goalie as well. And when I would explain some of the things that I was going through at the time, he kind of explained that he was going through the exact same things. And I think having someone relatable to you as an athlete, as a person, and who's had a concussion as well, he was like the person that I looked forward to speaking to the most. Obviously, I love my parents and I love my friends, but I hadn't even met Doug yet, known what he looked like. But I felt like when I spoke to him on the phone, he kind of understood everything that I was going through, and he could really offer invaluable advice. I kind of explained to him, I remember a specific time that he was one of I don't know if he even remembers this, but he was one of the first people that I kind of explained to that I was drinking a little bit more than I had in the past. And he explained that he obviously experienced similar things. And I think having someone who is similar to you is amazing, but having someone that's gone through post-concussion syndrome is it was vital to how I overcame everything, for sure.
And that's one thing that all of the post-concussion families we've worked with have taught us. And so we actually have a mentorship program. If you're looking to connect with someone who might have a shared experience and can help guide you through and keep you hopeful, whether it's concussion, post-concussion syndrome, or suspected CTE, or even for caregivers, you can submit a request to the CLF helpline. We're building a great network of mentors, and we're thrilled that Noah actually volunteered to pay it forward and mentor the next person. So Noah might end up being your son's mentor. So please reach out to the helpline. You can find that link in our chat. And finally, Noah, what's your hopeful message to those watching who may be struggling right now?
Yeah, obviously it's a really crazy time in the world, and I was speaking about it with Doug, speaking about it with you, and speaking about it with my family, and I can't even imagine the position that I would be in right now if I didn't have all the support of all the people that helped me. But also, obviously, right now is a really difficult time, and any kind of advice I could give is that you'll get through it. There was definitely times that I thought that I was never going to be myself again, and that was obviously my biggest concern. And then as things got better, I thought that my next concern was am I ever going to be able to play competitive soccer again? Because I felt that was one thing that truly defined me and kind of brought out the best in me. And if I could give you a piece of advice, it definitely takes time for sure. The physical symptoms kind of slowly go away, but the mental symptoms and the emotional symptoms are the ones that kind of last a little bit longer. But just don't be afraid to reach out to people. Don't feel that you're kind of giving anything away about yourself. Just get help from as many people as you can, and you'll get through it.
That's great advice, Noah. Great job. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's show Noah some love in the chat. I'm already seeing some nice compliments to you. So everyone appreciates you sharing your message. So thanks, buddy.
Appreciate it.
All right. So our next guest will now talk about her experience. She's been courageously sharing her story for many years to help prevent what happened to her son from happening to other families. CLF Family Advisory Board member Karen Kinzel-Zagel lost her son Patrick to suicide in 2014 at age 32. Patrick started playing football at a young age, went on to become a running back for Dartmouth College. After his death, Patrick was diagnosed with CTE by researchers at the VA BU CLF Brain Bank. CTE is different from PCS, as I mentioned. CTE is an injury. It'll get better with proper rehabilitation and time. CTE is different. Neurodegenerative, meaning it changes and evolves over time. But we can tell you from our research, it doesn't mean it's a straight line into very bad places. It takes a long time to change. There's lots of opportunities for treatment. There's long plateaus. So sometimes some symptoms get worse. Sometimes some get better over time and with treatment. And so CT can cause different crises at different points in time. But the important thing I want to say is it's not a death sentence. I mean, there's a very good odds I have it. I don't look at it as a death sentence. So, but it can be difficult. So Karen Kinzel-Zagel launched the Patrick Risha CT Awareness Foundation to help educate people about CTE and help other families. And Karen, thank you so much for being here today and for talking about such a tough topic. So when was the first, and we talked about this prior, so I wanted to jump into the lessons that you want to share. When was the first time you noticed Patrick changing and he had suicidal ideation? Can you hear me? Sorry.
Just came back. I'm sorry. You were frozen.
Oh. I said, when was the first time you noticed Patrick changing and he mentioned suicidal ideation?
The first time, well, I want to start out with Patrick as a little kid. He was like the most loving and sweetest kid in the world. I have his picture here. This is Patrick when he was little. And he started playing football at 10 years old. And he was fearless and tough on the football field. And even on and off the football field, he was fun-loving, cracking jokes, always making people comfortable. In high school, he was the running back. He's the one that had to go through the line. He would use his head first, and he would hit this huge clump of guys, and he would try to make that huge clump go forward. Sometimes he would get through, but most of the time he was on the bottom of that clump. And after games, we started to notice that his body looked red like a piece of meat. It was like raw, just in his personality. He angered easily, he was testy, he was inconsiderate, and he started drinking. And he even experimented with drugs, and it was a dramatic shift. And I never suspected football. He'd been playing football for 9 years. I didn't make the connection. I went on the internet, I looked up that the protein drinks that he was using to build muscle mass maybe could be taking the serotonin out of his brain. So I thought that was it. And that year I had to ground Patrick for drinking. And it was the first time I'd had to ground him. He was such a great kid to raise. And I got a call at work the next day, and Patrick was begging me to unground him. And I refused. And I encouraged myself to stay strong for his sake. For 2 weeks, and we were not allowed to see him. We went to pick him up, and we met the psychologist, and the psychologist was effusive about Patrick, how wonderful he was. He gave us no indications that there was an issue. But Patrick was over 16, so I don't know if that had anything to do with it or not. But we didn't know we thought he was fine, and he acted fine after that.
Mm-hmm. And then how did the symptoms progress, and what did doctors eventually diagnose him with?
So after high school, Patrick went to Deerfield Academy in Massachusetts. He did very well. He made lots of friends. The teachers loved him. The next year he went to Dartmouth, same thing. He got to play as a freshman, which was really cool for him. He was supposed to be the guy come sophomore year. We would hear occasional stories about his drinking escapades, and he struggled on and off with his books, but it just seemed like normal college life until his senior year. And his senior year, he started to be reclusive. He quit football. He unbeknownst to us, he had become addicted to Percocet. And when he was having trouble taking a language class, the psychologist did a test on him. He needed it to graduate from Dartmouth, and they discovered audio processing disorder, which was really strange. When Patrick graduated, he was a different Patrick than we knew. And we discovered his addiction. We sent him to rehab. After rehab, he was still reclusive. He was struggling to get going. And then he was diagnosed with ADHD. And then more addiction issues popped up. He had to go to rehab again. And they diagnosed him with explosive disorder. And in the years that followed, he was diagnosed with depression, anxiety, and then after losing his dad, PTSD. And all these came with pharmaceuticals and more addictions. And then he started smoking, and he hated smoking. We knew we had a problem. Doug's doctor thought it was borderline disorder. I had hired a doctor who thought it was bipolar. None of it really made sense. A concussion specialist assured us that it was due to his addictive problems. And that was probably the worst diagnosis, because from that point on, anytime he struggled, anytime he stumbled or slurred a word, we would ask him about drugs, and it just disappointed him and made him so sad and angry.
Yeah. Well, I know you worked so hard to get him all the help that you could at the time. We talked about it, in 2014, doctors didn't understand as much, and they do because of people like Patrick, and because of your choice to donate. And I remember, I think he's one of the first 10 college football players we had diagnosed, and people didn't know about it.
Yeah.
So now we'll get to the difficult part, but this is about crisis, and I've heard you tell the story before, and so I wanted you to share it so you can share your positive message with people. Can you share with us that final crisis? How you responded, how you look at it today?
Yes. So Patrick and I talked about suicide now and then, and he admitted to me that.
Actually, Karen, your sound cut out 1 second. So just when it comes, we don't want people to miss this. Okay, now you're back. So you can start again. You talked about suicide on and off.
Okay, we did talk about suicide, and he always assured me that he thought about it, but there would be nothing that he would do. He would never do it. He told me he had dark thoughts, and they were too awful to share with me. And he told me he had to do online gambling to distract from the dark thoughts. And he said smoking marijuana made him calm down. And those were two things that I was so against. I worried about suicide, but I hung on his promise that he wouldn't do it. And I worried about him more accidentally hurting somebody else, because his anger issues were so strong. And I thought he would get in a car and maybe wipe out a family unknowingly, just speeding down the road. Looking back, there were signs I was going to lose him. He started to become unshaven and scraggly looking. And Patrick was always so handsome and knew it. And that was a shocking thing when we saw that. He started organizing things and selling things on eBay. And I thought he was trying to get extra money for gambling. The last day, he reached out to some of his old friends and just said hi. When he walked into the garage, his uncle said that he walked in, he was calm and fine. It was also the eve of his father's birthday. And his last phone call was to me. And it was a nightmare. I argued with him about how he had so much to live for. I argued with him about Peyton was only 2 years old. He needed a daddy. We argued about how his family would be devastated. We loved him so much, we'd be inconsolable. I never told him that whatever it is, we'll fix it. I never told him I'll be there in 5 hours. I'll get in the car, I'll be there, and we'll make everything better. I just wasn't prepared.
Thank you for sharing that. So you came on here because you started the foundation because you want to help people and you want to educate them on this. What's your message to other parents out there watching?
I have eight things that I want parents to know that I learned. We tried to give Patrick a lot of love and a safety net, but we also tried to teach him life's lessons. And Patrick was a 32-year-old Dartmouth graduate. We were in the dark that he had a disease. I'm not an expert, so take this with a grain of salt, but this would be my action plan if I ever had it to do over. 1, I would say I loved them as much as I could. I'd never stop. There'd be no such thing as too much for me. 2, tough love doesn't work. And I was taught this in the rehab centers that to practice tough love helps them, and it was such a mistake. Patrick even said he knew what I was doing and that I was trying to let him hit bottom, and he even knew that the tactic wasn't working. 3, I would look for concealed emotions, to dig a little bit into what concerns them. Patrick was so proud, and he could put on such a wonderful front for a short period of time, but inside he was truly struggling with great pain and great worries, and none of us were aware. 4, I would help them find purpose. We know some great folks with possible CTE that are doing just some amazing things. Mark Monroe, he uses his Twitter account from his couch, and he's made great advances in sensor technology for the military and for NASCAR. And Chris Boyce, he started an amazing Facebook support group for brain injury. And Jacob Chambers started spreading out information in his stunt double community. And Paulo from Florida, he started a concussion pain and mental wellness website. I mean, amazing things these guys are doing. And I'm thinking David Carson he's doing documentaries and telling their stories. So many people, so many are telling their stories and helping prevent this disease from going on any further. And Patrick would have been so perfect at that. Everybody said he should have been a sportcaster. And he was such a good storyteller. 5, I would watch for crisis situations that cause them to get worked up and upset. Because when that happens, they can go 3 days without sleep. They just get so, and I think that the non-sleep and the lack of impulse control, it's just a recipe for disaster. 6, a wonderful lady taught me this, that when talking to them, address their actions. Like the disease is like, treat it like it's a brain tumor and not their personality. Treat it like the disease is something other than them. And 7, watch that they eat well and that they avoid alcohol, because that all inflames their brain and can make the symptoms worse. And 8, lastly, offer hope. I wish I would have done that. That was something I didn't do and I regret. We've learned that CTE is 100% preventable. We're working hard to stop it. we need to stop suicides too. And I would give anything for the chance to do that again.
Well, you're doing it today. So we can all see how hard this is. So I want to thank you so much for sharing your story and sharing this with us. I'm seeing all these wonderful messages come through in the chat. Please send your love to Karen. We'll also put Karen's website up so you can send her a note directly through the website. But this was amazing and powerful and really helps frame the next part of this conversation. So thank you so much. It was great seeing you in January or February at the huddle, and I can't wait till next time we can see you.
Thank you.
All right, best of Doug.
Thanks.
All right. Well, that was powerful. Thank you again, Karen. So stopct.org is the website. We're putting the link up. And to echo what Karen said, what Dr. Dockery and Dr. Reiss will be going into further in just a moment, there is help available. There are many resources out there. An excellent one is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. That number will be on your screen here in a moment, 1-800-273-8255. We'll also put it in the link, but just know that that's there when you need it. So we all take a breath and I'll reflect on that. And again, remember, we're talking about two different populations. If you just had a concussion, you haven't played 10 years of football like some of us, CT is very, very, very unlikely to be involved. And so it's a different animal, but it is a very important thing we need to talk about. So now I'm going to invite our first expert to share her wisdom with us. She's been an advisor to CLF for a long, long time. We're thrilled to have Dr. Ciara Dockery here with us today. She's a licensed clinical psychologist with a private practice in New York City, where she specializes in crisis intervention, trauma-informed interventions, suicide prevention, and public outreach. She also serves as the director of the NFL Lifeline, a free 24/7 emotional wellness and suicide prevention hotline for the NFL community. Dr. Dockery, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Chris. And I am also sort of just so moved by Karen's story and Noah's story. And, you introduced me as an expert, but what they just did is exactly what we need to be doing to prevent suicide, to reduce stigma about reaching out for help. So I just want to thank you both so much. I do this, day in and day out, and I am always just really begging people to tell their story like you both just did. So thank you for that. Like Chris said, my role is, I work, and actually Chris just had the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline up. I work for an organization called Vibrant Emotional Health. We actually run the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. We also run FEMA's Disaster Distress Helpline. Those of you in New York, like me, NYC Well, which is the largest single point of access for mental health care services in crisis. And then like Chris said, I run the NFL Lifeline. So I work specifically in suicide prevention and crisis intervention work for current and former NFL players. And I'm gonna share my screen now. Hold on one second while I do that. Partially, sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. Part of why I do this work is that my dad played in the NFL. He had 6 concussions that he knows of, that he can remember. So this is personal work for me. And I am really happy to be here today talking with you guys. So, I do want to talk about suicide. We're going to talk about crisis, but, I want to talk about sort of the state of suicide in our country for a second. This is often how the story is presented, right? Almost 45,000 people die by suicide a year, 750,000 hospitalizations, 1 million attempts requiring medical attention, another 2.6 million attempts that don't require medical attention, and then look at that, 12.6 million people seriously considering suicide every year. What we are doing or trying to do in the suicide prevention community, and what I want to share with you, because I really have 2 messages today. One is about how we can all prevent suicide in our community, in the CLF community, in our personal communities. But I also want you guys to come away feeling like you have the personal sort of skills and confidence to talk about this with someone you love. And you feel able to ask about it and talk about it. So this is how we often look at it, and it's a very bleak picture. However, if we sort of flip that around, and this is how I see it, you know, 12.6 million people seriously consider suicide every year, and, you know, 45,000 die by it. That means for every person that dies by suicide, 266 seriously consider it. There is a huge room in there for prevention. Something is happening in that space that is keeping those people alive, that is keeping them from acting on that. And that's really the space that I work in. That's the research we do. That's figuring out how can we really get that number to zero at the bottom there. So I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about our community and suicide prevention. First I want to talk about, you know, and this is stuff that Chris and CLF is already doing, but I'm sure most of you guys have heard about this sort of contagion effect, right? Like if suicide happens in a community, often the suicide rate goes up in that community. In the same way as if there's a suicide of a prominent figure and the media reports on it, we often see a spike in the suicide rate after that. And there was an amazing piece of research out of Austria where this group of researchers decided, you know what, like, let's flip that around. So what they did was next time there was a suicide in the community, rather than reporting on the suicide, what they actually did was actively push out stories of people who had struggled with suicidal ideation, how they had coped with it, how they had come through it, how they had gone on to live fulfilling, happy lives after that. So basically putting out stories of hope and recovery. And then what they were trying to do was to stop that contagion. They were trying to stop that increase that we would see following the prominent suicide attempt. And instead, what they actually saw was a decrease in suicide in that community once we put those stories out there. And to me, that is so huge. That means we actually have the power through doing things like Noah did today by telling his story about how he had these thoughts and he was able to come through it. He was able to cope. He was able to lean on his support system. Eventually was able to talk about it and ask for help. All of these stories can not only reduce stigma and whatnot, they can actually prevent suicide and actually save lives. So I want you to hear that, all of you, because everybody who is listening to this webinar can do something to prevent suicide. And so part of that is really trying to promote these stories of how people can cope and live with this. And Chris, you are doing a great job with that around CTE and post-concussion syndrome, and how, you know, getting stories out there about people who live and cope and have productive, meaningful lives. And Karen, you also brought this up. You know, in the end, suicide itself is, we know in the research, it really comes down to an intense kind of loss of meaning or purpose. And the CLF community has given a lot of meaning and purpose to folks and has changed what could be kind of a degenerative brain disease without a cure to actually something that we can work with, and we can show stories of how people cope and how they can have fulfilling lives, and we can prevent suicide that way. So to take a step back, part of my work, and this is kind of what we're up against, and Chris referenced this briefly, but with athletes, there's a lot of barriers to care. That's a very clinical term, but what that means is there's a lot of reasons they don't ask for help, right? And for me, these are the things that sort of keep me up at night as a suicide prevention specialist. In this population, there's a lot of pressure to present well, right? These are high achieving folks, and this is true across other high achieving populations as well, but there's a lot of pressure to present well. And by the way, they're really good at it. As Chris talked about, you know, they can present like they're doing pretty well when they're dealing with some really intense stuff underneath. So really be mindful of that. And why that concerns me is that presenting well to the world leads to real isolation with these feelings, right? So the more we can get folks talking about these feelings, the less alone people are going to feel with them. There's that whole mental toughness thing that we instill in athletes from an early age. It's sort of like a weakness to ask for help, or they should be able to help themselves. Huge amount of shame. We know this, and stigma. A lot of athletes taught to play through pain, right? How did they, they played through hitting their heads a million times, right? And through that pain, that extends to emotional pain too, that you just tough it out and you play through it. So there's a huge amount of minimizing and denying too, which further leads to isolation. And then, a lot of athletes, and this is certainly true of NFL players, but I think this is true in general, often see themselves as a provider of support rather than the recipient of it. So whether that doesn't have to be sort of just financial support, that can be emotional support, or they're up on this pedestal, and it's really difficult to then flip that dynamic around and ask for help when you have been the helper for so long, potentially. And then, of course, this internalized perfectionism that many of us probably struggle with, but those high standards can really create a real black and white idea of what reaching out for help means, that it means failure rather than strength, which is really how, we sort of see it. So, I told Chris we talk about signs of crisis. I don't like to spend too much on kind of warning signs for suicide, or really that much time on warning signs of crisis. I think the most important thing is if somebody you know or love starts acting differently than they normally do, that maybe you got to check in. Something's going on. Usually when someone's in crisis, their behavior changes. They look different. There are different signs, whether they're emotional, cognitive, physical. One that's really concerning to me is that isolation. I know I've said it a lot. It might be my mantra during this, but that isolating, the avoidance, not wanting people to see how poorly they might be doing is a big one, and isolation is a big risk factor for suicide. So, and then, poor sleep. I know Karen referenced this. Sleep is a great barometer or temperature taker for how someone is doing, for how you are doing. You might want to check in your sleep lately, but it's also a great foot in the door, because folks are usually more comfortable talking about their sleep than they are about their feelings. So asking about sleep can often be a good sort of foot in the door in that way. As part of my work, we've tried to kind of equip regular people to be able to have conversations, difficult conversations around, whether it be suicide or any type of crisis. So, as part of my work at the NFL, we developed this CAPE training. It's sort of the CAPE model. So it's usually a day-long training. You're going to get like 2 minutes right now, but I can certainly connect separately on it. But basically, if you guys can remember these 4 steps, I think it'll really help in approaching these conversations. I do think people avoid asking tough questions. They avoid asking about suicide, partially because they're afraid of what they're going to hear, and they're afraid of if they can handle the answer and what are they going to do with that answer once it comes. So I'm going to go through these 4 steps, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time specifically on what are best practices in terms of assessing for suicide risk. But the first thing you want to think of when you want to check in or have a tough conversation with somebody is really that connection piece. There's a lot of research into, we look at what makes successful calls on our hotlines, like, what makes for a good call, and almost always establishing that connection at the beginning. Once you have them, once they're connected to you, you can ask lots of things you wouldn't otherwise, and you can help them in a lot of ways. So part of that connection is going to be relating to them in a non-judgmental, empathic way. This part is really hard, and even as a clinician, this is hard for me. So as like a non-clinician, it'll be even harder, I think, for everyone else. But in that early stages, when you're trying to talk to someone about how they're doing, and you can tell they're struggling, we often want to jump to problem solving really quickly, right? because we hear their pain and we love them or we care about them and we want to solve it really quick. And so we want to start throwing out suggestions or here's what we're going to do. If you can take a breath, if you can take a step back, if you can establish like a safe space for them to just talk. A lot of times the most therapeutic thing for someone is to be heard and to be seen in what they're going through. And part of that you can also do to enhance that is to kind of paraphrase back to them what you hear. I know it sounds kind of elementary, and it's hugely impactful when someone is in crisis to hear someone reflect back what they just said. They feel heard, they feel less alone. It's a really important part. The next step in the sort of CAPE model is that sort of appraising and assessing the situation and its impact. And this can be in all domains, but I do want to talk about suicide in particular, because we've been talking about that today. You know, there's a ton of research, and I won't go into too much like dirty PhD level of it, even though this is what I, you know, love to talk about. But these are sort of the 4 core areas that we want to look at when we are concerned about someone from a suicide standpoint, right? And these are really well researched. So I'll go through each of them so you can have a better sense of kind of what you would want to explore with somebody that you're worried about when you're worried about their safety. The first is the desire for suicide. Those are the thoughts that they're having about, so that's the ideation. And encompassed in that desire is the huge amount of psychological pain that they're experiencing, the helplessness, the hopelessness, this feeling of being intolerably alone. That can be a big piece there to check in on. And one thing in that, in desire that I always want to check in that's worrisome to me is this idea that they feel like a burden to their loved ones. That can be a big red flag, because once somebody starts feeling like they're a burden to others, then the risk starts to go up even more. So keep that in mind too when you're talking about that. The next is their intent, right? And in intent to die involves asking about their plan. Do they have a plan? What is the method going to be? Have they known? And here is also some of the preparatory behaviors we talk about, where people, you know, give away prized possessions, they say goodbye to people. These are things that oftentimes, like Karen talked about, we look back on and we can see them, but at the time, you know, we have other reasons that we think those things might be happening. Just keep that in mind under assessing sort of for their intent. And then obviously if someone says they're going to do it and they express intent, take them seriously in that. And then the third is sort of their capability. And this goes to, they've told you their plan. Do they have access to means? Do they have the availability to go through with that plan? So if they say, you know, if it's a firearm or medication, do they have those in the house? Because that's going to be somewhere where you can intervene to get those out of the house to keep them safe. Also around capabilities, history of previous attempts. We know that makes risk higher, and that's primarily because, for lack of a better word, suicide, unfortunately, you know, it's hard to do, and sometimes there's this sort of practice effect or this desensitization that happens through multiple attempts that makes it more possible in the end. And then again, like we've talked about, an exposure to somebody else's death by suicide is also something that will sort of increase their capability to act on it. And then this last one that I want to talk about, and I'm mindful of the time, so I will be quick on these, but is really, and we don't remember to do this sometimes, but to assess for kind of what are their reasons for living still? What are their buffers that they haven't? I often ask, like, wow, you've been feeling all of this, but you haven't acted on it. What has kept you from acting on this plan? And there's going to be a great point where you can reinforce, because a lot of times those are going to be people they love in their life. They never do it for their kids. It could be around faith or core values that they, a sense of purpose, right? And if you can reinforce those things, engaging with you, I tell our crisis counselors, if they're talking to you about their suicide, part of them wants to live. So you're talking to the part of them that wants to live. So really reinforcing any planning they have for the future, all of that, and their social supports and immediate supports, and connecting them to those is going to be important. So in this space, we got to get comfortable asking the actual question. That might actually take practice. We're not used to asking this, but you got to figure out how you're going to spit it out and ask it. So that I think that a lot of the way I do it often is reflect back. You know, sometimes when people are in as much pain as you're telling me, they start to think about suicide. Is that something you've thought about? Rather than saying, you're not thinking about suicide, right? I mean, those are two different ways. So find what's natural for you. And I think I went through these, and I'm mindful of time, but you want to ask about, you know, how they would do it, they intend to do it, do they have the means to carry out, and what's kept them safe in the past, and if they've had past attempts. So again, in the CAPE model, from there you would go through problem solving. That really needs to be collaborative. It can't be your idea of what's going to help them. You got to find out what they feel capable of doing, and making it a collaborative effort to get them to the next step and to keep them safe and to get those means out of their house. And then lastly, there's this engagement, and that's engagement. The E is really to engage them to a resource. You know, you are not going to be the end all resource for them. You are going to be the hand that holds them to the person that they need and the treatment potentially that they need. And then also in that engagement, and Chris said this, there's a lot of research around follow-up. Following up with folks is huge. In a study in the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline with 625 suicidal callers who received one follow-up call, 80% of them in a survey after said that call contributed to them not acting on their plan. Of the 80% that said that, 50% said that call was the reason they didn't go through with their plan. So like, think about that for a second. A stranger calling them to check in was the reason they didn't act on their plan. So as Chris said earlier, you cannot check in enough. You cannot follow up enough. If anything, they'll tell you you're bothering them or whatever, but the follow-up is really huge. So again, these resources, Chris talked about the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, Concussion Legacy. If there are any folks from NFL family, NFL Lifeline is independent, confidential, free, 24/7 resource. You can also go to Be the One Too to get this is the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline's plan and campaign as to how to help folks in suicide, and everyone can do something to prevent it. And again, for our community, I love these webinars for really trying to reinforce kind of meaning and purpose in folks' lives and to hold the hope. And so the more folks can tell their positive stories of hoping, of resilience, recovery, hope, and healing, the more we can do to prevent suicides. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Chris, can you still hear me? Okay. I'm mindful of time, so I wanted to finish up.
No, thank you so much. That was amazing.
If there's questions at the end, please, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was amazing. Thank you for your time. And yeah, stick around for the Q&A. So, and I know people, we tend to go long with these because we tape them. So if you're exhausted, I know we're still 99% of the people who started are still with us. You can step away and know that you'll get the next section emailed to you shortly. But if you can stick with us, you're welcome to, because we have a very special treat coming here, which is Dr. David Reiss, who's joining us from San Diego. He's a psychiatrist, over 30 years of experience treating people of all backgrounds and conditions. He's been recognized internationally for his expertise in character and personality dynamics. He also treats patients with suspected CTE and has been a wonderful resource for us as we launched the CLF helpline. So we're grateful to have him with us today. Hello, Dr. Reiss, and then thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon, and it's my pleasure to be here. I've been a psychiatrist for quite a while. Actually, my first connection with sports medicine was with the Northwestern football team during my residency, and that goes back to 1978. I'd like to thank everyone who's already spoken for the important information, heartfelt, personal stories that have been shared. And I'm going to make my presentation a bit briefer and more focused. Basically, what I'd like to talk about is demystifying what it means to have a good interaction and good treatment with a shrink. And this is starting from the point that someone's willing to come in, and that in itself isn't easy. Yeah, so basically, you know, when you come in to see a psychiatrist, what do we have to look at? Well, when we're dealing with problems like this, we have to realize that we're not dealing with just a disorder. Depression may be experienced similarly by different people, but means very different things, that's different causes and different treatments. And I want to focus particularly on how it's different to provide evaluation and treatment when you're dealing with someone who has had head injury, whether it be acute or chronic. First, we're obviously looking at the neuropsychological factors, which is that injury to the brain can cause disruptions of being able to function emotionally. Very simple to understand, very difficult to really appreciate on a biochemical level and on a treatment level. That's not to say there isn't treatment, but we know a heck of a lot more than we did 40 years ago when I first started this, but we have a long way to go. But we always have to be aware that an aspect of what we're seeing is not just who the person is, but that they have a neurological, physiological issue that's impacting how they're functioning emotionally. Now, what does that mean to the psychological responses to the people have to their injury? Not just the physiological, but what are they experiencing that can make the depression worse? First of all, obviously confusion. What's happening to me? What's going to happen to me? What's going to happen to my family? Despite whatever's going on neurologically, those worries and fears of themselves cause a lot of anxiety and depression, as well as just practical disruptions. Practical disruptions, and it may be in a limited portion of someone's life, but it may be in multiple significant areas, and that these disruptions are more related to the injury, but they foster the depression. And the depression that you get from disruptions of functioning combined with the physiological depression, making it, that's why so many people have so many different diagnoses, because at different times, different things predominate. I don't treat diagnoses, I don't treat neurotransmitters, I treat people. And what do people have? Well, they have family, they have friends, they have relationships, all of which can be affected by depression, but all of which may have problems of different types that cause depression, and all of which can be affected by the effects of head injury, cognitive problems, loss of functioning. Beyond functioning with family, friends, relationships, significant others, obviously, can I work? Can I function in the workplace? Can I interact? Can I do what I need to do cognitively, interpersonally? That in itself can cause depression, especially going from someone who was previously high functioning, highly rewarded for what they're doing, who now is lost as to what they're going to do and can they even do it effectively. Also important and often overlooked is, can I still have fun? Can I still enjoy myself? Can I still participate in things that are safe and reasonable and give me some pleasure? A lot of times there are impairments that get in the way with that. People who don't have the cognitive abilities to, let's say, play poker as well as they used to, or they're afraid to meet with friends because their friends may see that they're limited. So there are disruptions in the ability to have fun that relate back to the neurological impairment, but of itself cause depression. And of course, with that is also just physical activity in general, from just going places, being able to ambulate, being able to travel, being able to participate in whatever activities that involve physical action that may no longer come as easily and certainly not on the same level. Now, this looks like a jumble. Well, it is a jumble because every person we see is a unique individual. And that's why you don't treat the diagnosis, you treat the person. Particularly when we're dealing with people who've had head injury. And that's what I really want to focus on very narrowly. The first thing is the nature of the injury. Sometimes we understand it neurologically, a lot of times we don't, but just on these graphic pictures, obviously the injury can occur in multiple different ways and lead to multiple different problems within the brain. That's not my expertise. I'm talking to neurologists and neuropsychologists about that, but we have to realize that every individual is different in that way, in the nature of the injury they've suffered on a physical basis, as well as the trauma that was involved in the injury itself, which is a whole different issue I won't go into in detail, but the whole issue of PTSD that may be related to the injury that occurred. Then you go to, well, what about who the person was before they were injured? Now, these days that we know enough to ask, we're often finding, I can't tell you how many people are admitted to psych hospitals, whether it be for depression or substance abuse, and no one ever asked them. They may have asked, have you had a TBI? But they've never asked, did you play ball in school? You know, were you an athlete? Were you a victim of domestic violence? So these are all issues that relate to who someone was before the injury, that then the injury becomes part of it. It may not be the whole story, but it truly all interacts. The first is just we each have our own unique neurochemistry. I'm not going to go into the details, but we all react differently to different physical, physiological, medical, dietary inputs. So we always have to be aware of that, even if we don't totally understand it, be aware that that's an issue. Very important is just our own innate temperament and personality. You know, is this someone who previously was always happy or always sad or tended to be moody or tended to be sociopathic or tended to have different types of obsessive compulsive personality traits? I mean, let's face it, I mean, unless you're 7'4" and 400 pounds, unless you're pretty obsessive, you're not going to make it in the NFL. So you have a lot of issues of just basic temperament and basic personality traits that are now either dulled or exacerbated and made more prominent because of the physical injury, but we can't ignore that that was an issue before. Maybe it was never even identified or was actually very adaptive, but it's still something we have to always take into account as interacting. And then you just have, we each have our own personal lives. I mean, no matter how much someone's devoted to sports, there are other things going on in your life. I don't have to enumerate all of this, as well as important events. Some people have had very exciting things happen in their life. They've had great lives. They're used to things going well, and things not going well becomes a problem in itself psychologically, because that sense that I'm sort of immune suddenly disappears, and suddenly I'm very vulnerable. I'm not immune. To the other side of people who've had different types of traumas, abuse, traumas that someone was responsible for, not responsible for, but people who have learned to defend themselves in certain ways because of past traumas. You add to this all the ongoing stresses and how the neurological impairment affects the ability to cope with all of this. And again, we're in a very different environment, treatment-wise, as to what we're looking at, how to understand it, and what to do with it. Obviously, there are really basically two modalities that we have for treatment. And again, I'm going to just go very superficially into some of the good parts and pitfalls of what this has to offer people with emotional problems post-head injury. There's counseling, whether it be individual counseling, and there are multiple different types and different theories, and I won't go into that right now. Group counseling, peer counseling also can be very useful. But basically, this is identifying and talking about your problem and seeking solutions with one or multiple other people, at times family sessions involving significant others. But I'm just going to leave that as a group in terms of counseling. And on the other side, of course, we have meds. We have a whole bunch of meds, none of which are perfect, all of which have potential pitfalls, and particularly some pitfalls in people who are post-head injury. So just going back here, we have two things which, first of all, have to be integrated. If you have a counselor talking to you and a shrink throwing meds at you here, and there's no interaction here, that just is not good treatment. Because because they each affect each other, and if you're not understanding what's going on both sides, you're not treating the whole person. So what are the good and bad parts of counseling? Well, obviously, hopefully a person, oops, I've lost my slideshow. Let me go back here. Sorry. Hopefully a person gains some understanding just of what's going on with them, becomes less frightened, and even if it isn't good, becomes more realistic. The most important issue is a gaining of trust with the people you're talking with, be it an individual or be it a group. That's why peer counseling is so important often to start to introduce someone to be able to talk where they feel comfortable. And often in therapy, the first 6 months or a year is doing nothing but relating on the basis to gain someone's trust. And, a lot of times docs will, if you're not responding in 3 or 4 weeks, well, let's try something different. Sometimes it takes 6 months, a year to gain the trust to even begin active treatment that's really going to be effective. Because just like any good coach can teach you all the techniques all you want, you can practice all the techniques all day long and become fantastic at it. If you don't trust the coach, if you don't trust your teammates, what good are the techniques going to do? So the main issue in treatment is establishing trust, leading to hopefully comfort, basically feeling better about oneself, less anxiety, less depression, etc. But let's just call it comfort without going into specifics of diagnosis. Now, what can go wrong, particularly with people who've suffered head injuries? This may not be very easy. Trying to understand, I've had people I see who understand perfectly what I'm talking about in the session, but by the time they leave, they can't really remember it, or they can't really internalize it or integrate it. So the downside of helping people to understand is realizing when you may be actually creating more confusion, and how you have to really go very carefully in introducing the understanding at a level that it can be understood, accepted, and integrated, not leading to, paradoxically, more anxiety and depression by sowing confusion. Again, most importantly, the downside of trust is suspiciousness. If you're seeing someone that you just don't feel comfortable with, if I'm going into surgery, I really don't care if the surgeon is an a-hole. I just want him or her to do a good job. But in treatment, you need to have a personal relationship. If you're not comfortable with that, all the suspiciousness that comes out of the neurological confusion and the neurological suspiciousness of not being able to tend to things or react to things like you used to be able to do, that's all heightened within interpersonal relationships, at home, with family, with parents, children, significant others. And if it's happening in therapy, you have to be careful you're not making things worse and back off to reestablish moving towards trust. The other thing that's very normal in therapy, but's uncomfortable, and that we saw here today very movingly, is that it brings out grief. I'm not going to say more about that, but that therapy isn't fun. Yes, there are times they can be joking, there are times it's enjoyable, but at times it's very, very painful. And someone has to have a lot of courage to be there. And the therapist has to understand and respect that courage and know how far to go, how quickly to go, and when to back off. In terms of medications, I'm just going to sum this up very briefly. We have a whole bunch of different medications. As I said, none are perfect. But and basically, the idea is to use the medication to improve your mood and all the other effects, sleep, appetite, concentration, that are affected by the depression itself. What often isn't realized is that these medications work somewhat differently in people who have cognitive problems, head injuries, for both physiological and psychological reasons. First of all, when we're dealing with athletes, we're dealing with people who are used to living an active lifestyle, in plain language, like living on the adrenaline. So just the sense of being flat, being unable to be excited, being unable to participate in itself, no medication is going to cure that. In fact, at times it can make things worse. So when medication works well, yes, whether it be through dopamine or this or that, it can help to improve mood. It can help the physiological aspects of the depression. Sometimes a stimulant is actually even better than an antidepressant, using something different to sleep, using something for nightmares or paranoia, all significant issues. But what we have to be careful for is, again, particularly in people who already are dealing with some cognitive impairment, that a side effect of many of the antidepressants and anti-anxieties medications we use is mild cognitive impairment. Often it's so mild people don't notice it, or they feel it's worth the trade-off for not feeling depressed. But take someone who's already struggling cognitively and take another 5% off by the effects of the medication, and you may have made things significantly worse. Along with that, just over-sedation. You know, people, yes, some people will crave just wanting to be sort of asleep all the time, but that's no good. That's not a good way to live. That's not really treatment, and a lot of times it makes the depression worse. Sometimes the medications, rather than calming, since they do try to lift up mood, will lead to agitation, and that is much more common in people who have any type of brain dysfunction, where just rather than triggering a safe activation, it triggers agitation. Often we'll see people, just more medications added to medicate the effects of the other medication. My view is best to start from scratch, look at what's going on, and evaluate something different. And I'll end with the last area, which is something that really I think is very much underappreciated, is most of the antidepressants we have, the SSRIs, the SNRIs, they're pretty good, not perfect, but pretty good at dealing with depression. But one of the significant side effects is they sort of dull people in general. You know, sometimes it's very mild, sometimes it's more pronounced, but people describe it as, I feel better, but it's like a wet blanket is thrown over me. You know, I'll have people who've never gone to a casino before playing penny slots just to try to get themselves excited. Now that's your average person that I'm seeing for different reasons. You take your athlete who's used to living on adrenaline, who's used to being on the edge, who wants that excitement, and suddenly everything they would normally do, even what they still can do for excitement, is boring, gets them nowhere. You can get to a real vicious cycle of increased impulsivity to try to bring back the ability to be excited. So again, that also has to be dealt with in therapy. What else can you do? What can you safely do? So in summary, everything needs to be integrated. You need the therapy, medication, you need a doctor who's seeing you as a person. And with that, no, we don't know of a cure for depression any more than we know of a cure for CTE, but it surely can be helpful. And there's really nothing mysterious about the process. Complicated, yes. Frustrating, often. But mysterious or scary, doesn't have to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Reiss. That was terrific. Really honored to have someone with your expertise and experience here, sharing your thoughts. So now we got a few questions that we're going to answer before we let you guys go, and then we can always do more in the future. So we're going to bring in Ciara as well. But as we do that, here's a good question that just came in. Biggest challenge this person has is finding somebody to trust. Is it common that I felt a lack of being understood?
Sorry, was that for me?
That's for either of you. Either of you.
Sure. Do you want to go, David? Go ahead. You were just
sure.
talking about these issues in therapy.
Yeah, very much so. You know, initially the person usually doesn't know what to expect. I mean, especially with a psychiatrist where there's medication involved and they think they're going to be doped up or this or that. But even if they're just seeing me for a consult, even there is a lot of anxiety about what am I going to have to say, what's going to happen, what is the person going to think. So just the first 10 minutes in the door can be very traumatic.
Yeah. Thank you. Any additional thoughts, Dr. Dockery?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of trust, it's just to go back to how we just don't socialize folks to talk about this stuff. And so it can be really scary to, we become very vulnerable, right, when we talk about this stuff. So I think it's quite natural to maybe feel some level of mistrust. It also could be related to relationships you had previously where there wasn't trust. I mean, not everybody grows up with an environment where there is trust to talk about this stuff, right? And so it's also based on kind of previous trauma you may have had in relationships where there wasn't trust. So I do think sometimes, just for everyone listening, sometimes we have to be the ones to reach out multiple times, maybe, to really try and start showing them, you know what, we're still here. You didn't want to talk to me this time? Okay, but guess what? I'm still here tomorrow, even if you blew me off, or I'm still here, just to show that you are going to be a reliable, trusted person in their life. So that's just my thoughts.
Just add, and to relate as a human being. You know, yes, you want to do a clinical interview and you have to get certain specific information. There's no rule that you can't make a joke. There's no rule that you can't smile. And you don't want to provide a lot of deep personal information, but there's no reason why you can't be human. And if you're not, you can increase the distrust, and that can actually get to a full-blown paranoia, but it will surely disrupt any real therapy.
Sure.
And this one just came in. I think it's interesting. I have someone who had a bad experience. How do I get them back into counseling?
I'll just say this. There are a lot of bad therapists and bad shrinks out there.
I was about to say the same thing.
Just be honest. You know, yeah. How many other things have you tried where the first store you went to really was pretty crappy? So
Right.
if it didn't work for you, you know, my view is no hard feelings. It didn't work. You don't have to play a blame game. You can just say, that person is not for me.
Right.
I need to find someone else.
And it is just so that they know, you can say it's very normal, sort of on the therapist side, for folks to want to try out, like want to check, you know, have a phone to test out. From my perspective, it also, I mean, treatment doesn't work if it's not a good fit, right? So I don't want someone coming to me where I'm the wrong person for them. My style doesn't work with them. Maybe they want someone works differently. Maybe they need to see a male therapist, whatever it might be. So you could certainly reassure that person that the therapist does not take offense at that we encourage that people find the right fit for them. And that may be seeing a couple different people and then deciding or chatting with them. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'll just add one quick thing, which is the flip side of that. I don't want to see someone who thinks I'm the perfect person for them, because then I'm going to disappoint them before the first session is over. So you want to be careful on both ends, but you want to establish trust, and that can take anywhere from minutes to years.
Yeah. And by the way, for all you watching right now, if you want to send your thank yous to Dr. Dockery, Dr. Reiss, we'll just do 2 more questions. Please do, because they can read them before this all disappears. But I know we appreciate it. What's the number one thing, this is from Ben Koldyke, the famous actor, is watching us. What is the number one thing you try to instill in a patient with CTE and depression?
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think it's such, you go, David. You were talking about treatment. Go ahead, and then I'll follow up.
I think the one thing is that you have a issue, but this is who you are. It's not your old person. And there may be other issues to deal with, there may not. But again, I'm going to look at you as a person, not as a disease. And you need to look at yourself. And what we have to get to is you look at yourself as a person and not a disease.
Absolutely. And I would add to that, and we are still learning so much, right? I mean, Chris knows that we all are still learning so much about what any of this means, and teasing apart, you know, what parts of the depression are due potentially to an underlying, you know, insult to the brain, or what parts of the depression may be more treatable, or maybe due to something going on in your life. Sometimes I speak with folks who, you know, think they have CTE, and then we start talking about, and they actually, you know, are going through intense grief. They just lost their mother. One incident where they just lost their mother, and they were going through a divorce. And so there's so many other psychological variables. It doesn't mean they don't necessarily have the underlying brain injury, but certainly we can treat a lot of the stress and a lot of the psychological stuff that's going on, and they're going to feel better. So I guess I would say that there is hope, that there are pieces of this that we can absolutely treat and we can work with. So we just need to sort of tease apart all of that. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Definitely.
I'll just say one, if I could ask one sentence. I often ask people right away, what would you think of the result if we had a 10% improvement? And almost everyone says that would be wonderful.
Right.
Yeah. Wow, that's a good point. So this last question, I feel like you've both been helping us do this, but one of the questions is, I got 3 questions all focused on, I can't seem to find the right doctors who understands my brain trauma history might be playing a role. And what's your answer to that? And I would say this with the idea that both of you have been finding us referrals like crazy for the helpline, because you basically are talking to your colleagues about who has an interest in TBI and has really been staying up on the literature and open to those ideas. Is it really that there aren't that many resources that'll tell you that, and just to continue to ask around and get referrals?
Go ahead. My
Sure.
view, just Chris, no surprise. It's not easy to find someone. I mean, I have a hard time finding consultants. So of course, people are going to have a hard time finding docs.
Yeah.
I think it's going to get better and better. The more you're doing this work, Chris, the more everybody out there is talking about this stuff, the more interest, I think, and the more professional development that we can encourage for psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists, whoever it may be that we need to get in front of. Because I agree, there's, I speak with a lot of folks who don't understand, part of the transition issues for athletes coming out of professional sports, all of those kinds of things. There's so many, so finding those niche doctors. But I think that, if I think about, Chris, when we first started talking, like 2013, when I was first in this role, there's so many more folks who are educated about this now, who understand the nuance of this work than then. So every year it's going to get better. But yes, I would say please contact CLF, and we're all going to be doing our best to connect and to keep on our radar clinicians that we feel like can work well with this population.
Yeah, and we just appreciate that you guys keep sending us people when we ask for help. So thank you. All right, so I'm gonna let the docs go. I know Dr. Dockery's got a child coming in. My dog is floating around there and might make an appearance soon. You never know. So thank you both for being part of this. Obviously, you can see from the kudos you're reading the chat.
Yeah,
everybody appreciates you guys being here, and we do at CLF too. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. My pleasure. Really.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll wrap up with a few comments here. I want to thank Dr. Dockery, Dr. Reiss, but I also want to thank Noah and Karen. Thank you guys for what you said earlier. We appreciate all of you tuning in and hope you're leaving having learned something new, and above all with an understanding that you're not alone. There's a lot of resources available to help you and your loved ones to receive help. We're always able to put on events like this for free through your support. So if you found this event helpful and want to pay it forward, we'll put a donation link there at the bottom, but we're going to keep coming back every week to try to help you guys out while we all get through this global crisis. We'll leave you today with a poll question you'll see popping up now, with a final look at the resources mentioned today and a few of the ways that you can connect with us at CLF. So we are wishing you and your family's continued safety and health during the pandemic. Take care of yourself, and I hope we helped you learn how to better take care of those around you.